Everything on? Alright. Okay. Welcome everyone. We're going to continue our series of shiurim on the Indian of heter iska. And the next source we're going to look at, until now, everything is, for the most part, I think there was maybe one achron. For the most part, they were either from the scripture itself, from the Talmud, or from the early Rishonim. This next one is from the shittah mekubetzes, who lived pretty much at the time of the overlap, the cutoff time between the Rishonim and the Achronim, so could either be considered a late Rishon or an early Achron. And generally understood as again from the same time as the mechaber, and his most important student was the Ariya Kodesh, was his student. So that's the yield on green. And so we're going to look at what the shittah mekubetzes, his name was Reb Betzalel Ashkenazi, and he lived in the Galilee, in Tzfas, in the 1500s. So when it came to really this concept of heter iska, it's already a Talmudic concept. And we see here Avad Rabbanan Milsa the Nichlas Arvayu, that the sages established, when allowing people to make what we come to call the heter iska, that we divide up 50%. That's the initial way it was formulated, and then later on it was changed somewhat. That half of the loan is a loan, the other half is an investment. And so therefore, both the borrower and the lender have just about equal gain and equal risk. So the shittah mekubetzes, commenting there on that Gemara in mekubetzes that we quoted earlier, says as follows: Im hayu oimrim achrayis kol hanechosim al malva. If the totality of the of the achrayis, of the responsibilities of these assets were in the domain of the loaner, tu loy boy lahamsi mois laani b'shas dechakai. The person loaning the money, he'll run out of money, and eventually there won't be any money to help the poor. So again, this is what we're describing here, is the requirement from an ethical standpoint to develop this formulation of what this the one who collected these sources would call capital markets, and what is often called the heter iska. That we develop ways, and all of these other examples we gave, like the example, even though it wasn't really discussed so much here, of the matnishchiv mera, that a man on his deathbed may give a gift while he's still alive to his wife of all of his assets, and therefore there is no inheritance for him to pass on to his children, and that's a subterfuge in order to allow the wife to, for all intents and purposes, be the heir of the late husband's assets, that the widow doesn't actually inherit, but she for all intents and purposes, becomes the inheritor of the estate. Why? Because for the ethical reason of that. And then the same thing, the crucible, the ethical necessity to encourage people to continue to loan money, even though the Torah imposes the requirement to forgive loans when the sabbatical comes. Therefore, it's only on personal loans and not on public loans. And then here, even though, again, the Torah prohibits making loans with ribbis, you have to excuse me, my brain is a little bit addled today. I didn't eat lunch yet. I should really have eaten before I start making the video. The interest-bearing loans are prohibited between Jews, but nonetheless we have this concept of the heter iska because in order to make it here, he's not even talking about allowing him to essentially receive interest through what seems to be a subterfuge, but rather that both the borrower and the loaner should take on essentially an equal amount of responsibility. And so therefore there's an ethical imperative in that. And in a certain way, I was thinking about this as far as hashkafa, as far as an outlook. Essentially, and this is the crux of the Torah giving us in the Jewish tradition, that the Torah is ambiguous for the purpose of interpretation, and that said interpretation should be beneficial for society. And not only that it's open for interpretation, but it is also open to, within the canon of what we have received, to find novel interpretations that are within the letter of the law in order to bring out the spirit of the law. And the value in this is that it gives us that reward. When we look at things in a way that is novel and yet legal and true, obviously there are certain boundaries that cannot be crossed. We become God's partners in His Torah. However, it must be done in the proper way. And for the most part today, there are almost no one who could really bring up a new interpretation that can majorly change the actual law. But the only thing is that we have to be proficient scholars in the law, and really nothing actually ever changes the law. we have to be proficient scholars of this law in order to find the most compassionate and ethical means of fulfilling the law. I'll give a different example as well. We have a statement in the Talmud about capital punishment. And there are three opinions there. It's a Mishnah in Makos. One is that if a court executes someone once in 7 years, said court is a chavlonis. It's damaging. It's dangerous. The next opinion is not once in 7 years, but once in 70 years. And then the third opinion said if he were alive, because by that time already the death penalty had essentially been abolished, not by choice, but by circumstance. So the third opinion said, had I lived in the time of the death penalty in Israel, I would have abolished it. So then they said back to him, who wanted to abolish the death penalty, he said, such people increase murders in Israel. Meaning, the death penalty should kind of like how it is in Pennsylvania right now. It's on the books, but it's almost never used. But it's there as a deterrent. And the ethical understandings of both sides, of one, not to be willy-nilly about constantly executing people, which, with all due respect, I believe is a slander against the Jewish community that the authors of the Christian books that they call the New Testament made against the Jewish community. And particularly when they, in the book of John, the Gospel of John, when they say that there was the one woman who was accused of adultery, and they said something, and they seem to link that to the Pharisees. If you understand the discussion there, if anybody was doing this, it would have been the Sadducees, not the Pharisees. This whole question of this term Pharisee is a discussion for a different time. Was that a self-identifying term, or was it an appellation given by others? We can discuss that at a different time. The Sadducees were much more of a clear political party. And they certainly were much more likely to execute a criminal than the rabbinical authorities that are called the Pharisees, by some would. And in a certain sense, it's almost like we think of. It's interesting because, again, some Christians, particularly Protestant Christians, they tend to feel they have more of a kinship with the Sadducees because they're like the Protestants. They're a sola scriptura group, and they reject the teachings of our sages. But the thing is that the message of mercy and compassion was much more to be found among the rabbinical teachings than among the sola scriptura teachings. The rabbis always interpreted things in the most ethical, moral, but nonetheless true manner. And then often would go above and beyond that letter of the law, additionally, to say that you have to be more righteous, more ethical, more moral than what the law requires. Or even if you don't have to, the spirit of the sages is happy when we do so. Even the whole method of casting the first stone, etc., very clearly a Sadducee thing. But more than that, is that the Sadducees, if you really think about it, they would be like when we think of in some fundamentalist Islamic majority countries, Muslim majority countries. Like you think of the Taliban or other places where they chop people's hands off or they execute people with very little recourse. And it's a very similar type of thing. That's who the Sadducees were. You know, they would be the ones who would perhaps take eye for an eye literally and poke people's eyes out, hand for a hand, chop people's hands off. Whereas the sages said that was a monetary restitution and not a physical one. And so too here, God gives us this blessing that we are united in this teachings of Torah, to find within Torah not just reading things the way you want to read them, but looking at things in a holistic manner. Like one of the things our sages said, Divrei Torah, Ashirim b'makom echad, v'aniyim b'makom acher. Aniyim b'makom echad, v'ashirim b'makom acher. The words of Torah could be poor in one place and rich in another place. What does that mean? It means that everything has to be within proper context. And if context is removed, we lose more than just the context. So here, we lose the whole thing. We need the context in a holistic view of Scripture in order to understand things properly, and not just look at one verse without understanding the implications that other verses will have on what is stated in that verse. Meaning, so, you know, if the Torah says someone who commits adultery is liable to the death penalty, both the married woman and the man who sleeps with her. The other way around, the status of the man doesn't matter in that sense of the capital offense of adultery. Could still be fornication, but it's not adultery. It's only adultery based on the status of the woman, whether she's another man's wife or not. The major reason for that, of course, would be to establish paternity, because they didn't have the technology we have today to establish paternity like they did. They didn't have such things. And so a woman cannot have two partners at the same time. There has to be some separation. Traditionally it's 3 months in order to ascertain paternity. If she has a baby, 9 months or 7 months or so forth after that. And back to what we were talking about, so both of the offenders, the man and the woman, are liable to the death penalty. Even without the death penalty, the husband would have to divorce the wife. And yet, with all of these things, we have to look at another verse in the Bible that says, Al pi shnei edim yokum davar. That the thing is only established by the merit of two witnesses. So therefore, if there are no witnesses, it's not an established thing. And so there is no death penalty and not even a requirement of divorce, to the point where the wife would lose her alimony. They could still decide to divorce, but that would be considered more like a no-fault divorce. And the husband would still have to provide alimony to the wife. Maybe that's different than what no-fault means today, but I'm talking about because that's another thing. Sages established the ksuba for what? Not to be a lovey-dovey poem like the Reform do now, but to protect the wife, that she shouldn't be divorced for no reason, and if she does, if the husband has no reason to divorce the wife, he owes her alimony. It's the same thing here when it comes to lending money. We have to look in a ethical and moral lens of how to establish this. Kol nechosim al malva v'suloi boi lahamsi mois la'ani shasta chakayaf al gab v'chayev loiva v'geneva v'veda lefi shistam revach hascheres huba halacha imakim lamakim derech yam v'yabashu v'nasim shchiche b'chol yoyim b'drachim. So we establish this capital market to say that half is a loan and half is an investment, to equalize the risk both of the lender and the borrower. Because if all of the responsibility for the assets were on the lender, he would have no money to help the poor when he's in need. And the thing is, even though that means that the borrower now has a responsibility, if it's a capital investment, that he has to pay back even if the money is stolen or lost. And that's because, generally speaking, he's only going to make a profit in his business dealings by traveling somewhere else, selling things, goes by the ocean or the dry land, and robbers are common in the roads, bandits, highwaymen. Across the coach roads they would ride, the sword and pistol by their side. Anyway, she knew, if the lender knew, if the lender had full responsibility, that even when the money was stolen or lost, he would have to be responsible for that. He would never loan money to begin with. If we put, however, the other way around, what if the responsibilities for all of the things that were against his out of his control that just happened, what if they all were the responsibility of the borrower? Like in the judgment that was he was responsible for all of the honor that was made for him, all that was shown to him. Like we said, Matana Shemechinam Liyoiska Shoyl. That would mean that like someone who is guarding something for free would be treated like a borrower. Maskinan de Bahahi Hanoa the Haman Le Mishabed Nafshe. So that benefit that he receives, that he's trustworthy, that he has this responsibility. So then we see from there that it would be sufficient for him to be treated like a borrower, like someone just borrowing an item. Kol shekain hacha. It's all the more so here. Already going 20 miles over the speed limit. This guy has to follow me. I'm not going 20 over the speed. I'm going 10 over the speed limit, but still. I guess I can slow down now since that guy's not on my back. Sheyesh le palga be'igra. So if half of it he has written down and receipt, the lahevi kashoil, so that half is like it's borrowed. So therefore, he's responsible for all of the happenstances that could happen if it's lost or stolen. Filahani imnamar kain loy iya adam shir to the iska. And that way, a person will not want to receive it as a business investment. Why? Because it's common for things to happen that people will lose. Theft and loss and accidents. Accidents happen. We should be spared from such things. He could dole out this money and lose it in one day. He could lose in one day more than he could than a year's profits. So it's not like someone's guarding something for free. That he's making and then before I said Matana Damasa, he's making a Tanai, he's making Tanai, wie soll ich sagen auf English? He's making a Tanai that it's like a condition, stipulation, that he's like someone who's just borrowing an item. He's not bringing the animal except that whatever it might be putting down as collateral, it's still grazing in the pasture. Or if he's borrowing utensils, if he doesn't take it out of the house, it's not really like a shoyl. This he wants to bring it, if it doesn't leave the house, doesn't leave the field, there's no major a shomer chinim, someone is guarding something. He's house sitting. He's guarding it there at the house. He's not bringing the animal or the utensils somewhere that it's more likely to be damaged. But if he brings it, he wants to bring it somewhere that it's dangerous, it could be damaged, he doesn't want that. He doesn't want to receive that. That's why the sages established this rule of Yodis. Alright. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. Looks like after this, there's some English explanation of the history from this author here, and maybe we can talk about it later. Alright, see you later. Thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment. We'll see you later.